Good afternoon and welcome to the Eastern Queens Alliance Community Cafe on affirmative action.
This is a streaming live on YouTube too.
He's gonna start, you want to sit again. Huh? Go and sit inside, I'm just hooking her up. Yeah. Okay, so we are getting ready to begin. Miss Mariama Jones is now on camera.
Sorry, figuring out volume and everything. That's fine. Oh. Really good. Okay, while I'm waiting for that to figure itself out, I'm that. Okay, I'm not great. Yes, it is. Okay, everybody. I think we're ready to start. I think we have all the technology figured out and everything's up. Everybody can see we're good. Awesome, beautiful. So what's up? Yeah. Dude. Anyway, Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you all. So my name is Miss Mariama Jones. So hello to everybody in the room. Hello to everybody that's on Zoom. And today's Community Cafe is going to be about the recent affirmative action case that happened in the Supreme Court. So raise your hands. Have we heard of this before? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Perfect. Beautiful. Raise your hand if it was confusing. Probably. Perfect. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be breaking down the subject for you. You guys will have the opportunity to give your opinions. I'll ask you some questions, but mostly I'm just going to be giving you some background information so we understand how we got here, what the case history is leading up to this, and what the case was about in real life. So at the very end, we'll break down the case. I'll make sure that you guys know exactly what was in there, what happened, what does that mean for us. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about what we should think about doing next. All right. So we are here to talk about affirmative action. It's going to be great. Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Lisa. I just realized that you have a hand up. How you doing?
I'm sorry. You had asked a question and I was answering it.
Oh, perfect.
I think you said something about raise your hand.
I appreciate you for participating through Zoom.
Greetings.
All right. So what we're talking about is affirmative action and what affirmative action even is. So before we even get started, we're going to talk about the history that leads up to affirmative action in the United States, just so that we've got all this context down. So there is a long history of racism in higher education in the United States, just from the founding of this country on. So generally speaking, a lot of the higher education institutes that you're probably the most familiar with, stuff like Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, all of those generally have ties to profits from slavery. People who founded those colleges, some of those colleges were even built by slaves. So there is a long history of Black people profiting or providing profits that go to these colleges, but not being able to attend them. Obviously, during slavery, no Black person was allowed to attend a higher education institute. So you could build the institution, you could serve people at the institution. Actually, there's an interesting one here on Georgetown. Georgetown was able to offer free tuition back when it was founded. And the reason it was able to do so was because Georgetown made profits off of a slave plantation nearby in Maryland. So people who went to that school initially got free tuition, literally based on the labor of African enslaved people. So again, long history of racism that is Black specific. You may have heard that some schools had slave quarters, specifically Harvard. So in case you ever wanted to know what that looked like, here it is. The building still exists on Harvard's campus, is now used as a memorial of sorts, and is not used for school purposes, but there were slave quarters in Harvard because, you know, if you were a rich white person, why would you be expected to go to your higher education institute without the enslaved person that does all of your chores for you? So you were allowed to bring them to school with you pretty much. So yeah, an additional thing that happened that was fairly interesting is that when we talk about racial inferiority and the science related to racial inferiority, that is also based in higher education. The people who were doing these types of research and promoting these types of ideas that people who were Black were somehow biologically inferior, which made it okay to enslave them. All of those people went to some sort of higher education institute, your Harvards, your Princetons, your Yales, and they would run around with the skulls of Black people and go, look, I found 3 holes in the skull. This means that Black people are obviously biologically inferior and wouldn't do well in an institute of higher education, or can't really be meant for any other job than being enslaved by other people. So again, long sordid history. Now, when we start to get away from this is sometime in the early 1830s in the United States. That's when we start seeing Black accepting schools. Now, these schools are not white schools. These are not your private white institutes. This is not your large Ivy League Northeastern schools. These are their own separate institutions. So for example, Cheyenne University, which later becomes an HBCU, is one of the schools that we're talking about here. Hang on, sorry, I'm just gonna move the Zoom a little bit so I can, yes. All right. So Cheyenne University opens in 1837 as one of the first institutions to allow Black students to learn at an institute of higher education. An important thing to note here is that they did not become a degree granting institute until 1932, a full 100 years later. So you as a Black person could go to this school, you could do all of the education, you could graduate, but there is no degree associated with that graduation. You just got to go. Oberlin College is a college that originally, when it was founded, allowed students of color in. This was a predominantly white institution that also happened to allow freed slaves. So one of the only of its kind in America. And they also graduated their first students around 1840s. And one of those students went on to found Howard, another really big HBCU. So that's cool too. And then we've got another university, Asham, which now is Lincoln, which yet again, another HBCU, which started in 1854, graduated people like Langston Hughes and Thurgood Marshall, who later became one of the, actually, no, the first Black Supreme Court justice. So there's an excellent history there, right? But it's a very small history. We're talking about 3 schools. And honestly, if you look back, it's not a lot more than that. You could probably count the number of schools in the United States pre-Civil War that allowed Black students to go. So that, you wondered what Oberlin College looked like. I found this really cool old picture. And then what you end up with is the maybe just one. So how often have we heard of a really old story where there's a Black person who got to go to a predominantly white university, but it was really just him in a school full of white children? Have we heard about this before? No? Your token Black person. So this was a time when we kind of had quotas. So in southern states, you couldn't go to school as a Black person at all. That wasn't the thing. But in northern states, they would allow the occasional Black student in, but it would only be one student. So for example, and this is actually pretty early, so that hold your applause here. But in 1823, there's a college called Middlebury in Vermont, and they allowed one Black student in 1823. He received a bachelor's degree. So they had the one. In 1850, Harvard attempted to allow 3 Black children into their medical school, but the white students made such a fuss about it that it actually ended up never happening. They ended up not admitting their first Black student until 1870. So 20-year delay on that one. 1857, there is a Black student who graduates from Yale College. There's another one who graduates from Yale School of Medicine. Again, just the one. And so pre-Civil War, you can count the number of Black graduates. 40 Black people graduated from a college or university pre-Civil War. 40 in the entirety of the country. So you can tell that this was a problem, right? Left to their own devices, schools did not choose to allow Black students into their universities. And this is what I'm talking about. Can we find the Black student? Can we see the one?
I think.
Yeah.
Is it in the second bottom row?
He's in that second row right in the
But you know,
building.
although he's like definitely Black, it looks like, you know, he just looks like a dark tan, not like, you know what I'm saying? Not
Yeah.
like real, like.
Colorism is a thing, so it's totally possible that if they allowed in the one Black student, maybe it was only the one light-skinned student who was
Right.
kind of passing, right? So again, but the point was that here they were like, we're gonna let one kid in, and then that's going to be our sort of claim to fame. We're not racist. We let in one Black kid into our medical facility or into our prestigious university. So the rise of HBCUs was really post-Civil War. Again, I showed you a couple that happened before the Civil War. There was 3. two before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, it really started to pick up. We started to get more HBCUs. So in 1866, Fisk was founded. In 1867, we've got Howard. 1867 also sees Morehouse and St. Augustine. We've got Hampton Institute or Hampton University now, which was in 1868. Howard adds a medical school in 1868. So if you would like to practice medicine, that is also now a possibility. So by the time we hit 1870, we've got about 22 HBCUs. And again, so to make sure that we're understanding this, the reason why we have these HBCUs, these historically Black colleges and universities, is because at the time you could not go to these white schools as a Black student. That was not something that was happening. Unless you were the one kid in the entire class, you weren't going. So if you wanted to be in a higher education institute, you pretty much had to go to an HBCU. Those were the rules.
May I add something, Mariana, there?
Oh, hi, yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too, just that when we start to think about the HBCUs and why they're founded, it's also, I think, important to acknowledge that our awareness and of our right to humanity and our right to learn, our freedom to learn, and that if we, the understanding and knowledge that if we're going to get it, it will be at our own getting, not waiting for someone to give it to us.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. So for everybody in the room who probably couldn't hear that, I know it's a little low. We just had Miss Lisa on the Zoom who said that it's important to note that when we're talking about HBCUs, this was Black people's way of saying, hey, I realize that I'm not going to get this education at all if I don't find it for myself, if I don't found it for myself, which is how we end up with a lot of HBCUs. Am I explaining that one correctly? I feel like I just want to make sure I got your point.
Yes, absolutely. And
Perfect. Excellent.
moving
So yes,
moving
that
forward,
is really important. That is something that we were trying to do to make sure that you had access to this type of education. We had to build our own universities because you just were not going to get into a predominantly white one. Or if you were, it was going to be at the same rates as before, where 40 Black people every 20 years get to graduate with a degree. So to make sure that that didn't happen, we make our own universities. Now I have this lovely section of our wonderful presentation here where we are going to talk about one step forward, two steps back. So this is a great way to encapsulate pretty much anything race related in the United States. But legally, if you see us take a step forward, know that somewhere we probably took two steps back. So I will tell you some stuff that's really good, and it will probably be followed by something that's not fabulous. So in 1904, the Kentucky legislature passed the Day Law, which prohibits interracial education, which basically means if you are a predominantly white university, you could not, by law, have any Black students who went to your school. And this law was not uncommon in several states. So something similar to the Day Law would have been passed, where you had to segregate your schools. So that was the thing. We follow this with a case in Missouri where the Supreme Court holds that a student, Lloyd Lionel Gaines, who wanted to attend University of Missouri Law School, had to be admitted and the school could not segregate because he was Black, or they could not deny him an education because he was Black. So good thing, right? What am I going to follow with? Bad things. So Mr. Lloyd does get into school. He is the first Black person to be in this law school. It's very prestigious, great for him. However, 3 months after this ruling, Mr. Gaines left his apartment to buy postage stamps and was never seen again. We don't know what happened to him. Yeah, we do. Thank you. We do know what happened to him. It wasn't good. So, as you can see, even when legally something positive happens, it's generally unaccepted. When you have a country that is founded on racism, you're going to have issues with racism if you don't address it directly. So even if a court makes a ruling that says, hey, you can't be racist, that doesn't mean that the world mystically becomes unracist, right? So following this case, in the 1950s, the Supreme Court had another case in Oklahoma State where a Black student was admitted to a previously all-white graduate institute where they basically said that you can't segregate and that all students are allowed to receive equal treatment in all aspects of the education process. So this was another step towards desegregation before we got there officially with Brown v. Board of Education. So you can see us turning in this direction. We're making a positive step, right? What am I going to follow it with? Okay. So sorry. I'm so sorry. For your context, for that one Black student, this is what your segregated classrooms would have looked like. So if you are an unsegregated school, even when you're an unsegregated school, if you have a Black student, your Black student is still separated physically from the other students in the class. This was not an uncommon setup. So. Yes, he is. He is in the hallway. He has to do his entire education from outside of the door of the classroom.
I didn't even realize that. I'm glad you put that up.
So imagine having to get yourself an education and you can't even see your professor. You have to hear him from outside in the hall.
And as you can, if you look at that picture, it's like someone's just resting their books on a seat that could have been his.
It could have been. Oh, I see a hand, Miss Lisa.
Yes, and what I'd like, you're talking to students in the room, right? Okay, so one of the things, because I work in higher ed and I'm in an environment that is a predominantly white environment, I ask students to be thinking about what that picture looks like today.
That's a great question.
Because
so what do you think this would look like today? If we were segregating in a classroom today, do you think you would see something like this in a school? Segregated in a classroom today. Oh, yeah, with the advent of new technology, do you have your Black students just on Zoom? Only white kids get to attend in person. That could be the way that you end up segregated. Yeah.
Before we want to deliberate, now they give us more access to cause confusion.
Sure, it's subtle now, right?
Unseen, so like the whole thing with they didn't want us to have access to know how to read, but more than read, just reading words.
Right.
Body features, there's 85% of communication is nonverbal, and reading is part of the language. So they didn't want us to pick up on things. They wanted us to be dumb that blind.
Right.
Dumb that blind.
And you get to back yourself up that way. You get to, it's very easy to say, oh, look at Black people, they're so uneducated, when you refuse to educate them.
And made laws, made it illegal to not educate.
Missing the slavery aspect. I'm sorry, Miss Lisa, I heard you, but just a little bit. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was saying, and made it illegal for you to be educated.
Correct. Made it illegal for you to be educated.
And a fine for somebody else would have to also be fined for teaching you.
Yes. Let us not forget that even if someone wanted to educate you, if there was a white educator or a white school who wanted to allow Black or brown students into their classroom, there were repercussions to that. If you were a teacher who wanted to teach about something other than that, if you wanted to teach that slavery was bad, that was a fireable offense. If you were a university and you wanted to let in brown students, there was a law in Kentucky that said you couldn't do that.
And thus the laws we are seeing in Florida, Texas today.
Oh, yes.
It's not made up.
You're now seeing in Florida where you can't teach Black history in school because it makes other students uncomfortable. It's not gone, guys. It's not gone. So, oops. Let's talk about the segregation era. We haven't even gotten to segregation. You would think this whole time we've been talking about it. We haven't. So state schools were basically all white, right? Unless you had an established HBCU, it was a white school. But we started to get out of racially exclusionary practices when we had two cases, one in 1950 called Sweat v. Painter, and then of course, Brown v. Board of Education, which I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with, but I'll break it down for you in just a second. So Brown v. Board of Education is the official case that technically ended segregation in the United States. It was the Supreme Court saying that separate but equal does not work, or that separate but equal doesn't work. It's always separate and not equal. So in order to make sure that there is equality and equity in the United States, we are going to integrate schools. That's basically your conclusion from Brown v. Board of Education. So that's what we're working towards. We're working towards getting to an integrated school system, but I am here to show you that, again, one step forward, two steps back, right? So in that 1950 case, Sweat v. Painter, a Black person was trying to get into University of Texas Law School. His name obviously was Marion Sweat, last name Sweat. So during his first semester on campus, a group of KKK members burned a cross on the law school outside of his dorm, just to make sure that he understood that he was not welcome there. He also received a lot of harassment from students and teachers while he was at the school. And what ended up happening is he ended up leaving 2 years into the school without receiving his law degree. And again, not uncommon here, right? Where you can have the right to be in the school, right? Legally, a court can say you have to allow this person on your campus, you have to give them an education, but it doesn't say that you have to make them comfortable while you do it. And racists will take that to the furthest extent. They will make you as uncomfortable as humanly possible to try to get you out of school. So not uncommon. Again, 1956. So after we've had all of these cases that require integration, we had someone named Miss Lucy. She was the first African-American to enroll at the University of Alabama, which caused riots, and then she was expelled for her own safety. Big quotes there, but yeah. And again, 1956, we got University of Florida Law School. They admitted someone named Virgil Darnell Hawkins following a Supreme Court decision that said that they had to. Hawkins withdraws his application as a condition by which Florida agrees to integrate the school. So Florida says, hey, we'll integrate the school, but the kid who brought this case to try to get into school, he can't come. If he comes here, I won't integrate. And this is after we have a Supreme Court decision that says you have to integrate your schools. So this wasn't a smooth process, right? If you wanted to be Black and educated in America, you had to fight for it. And it was an ongoing fight. It's not just, I have to fight to get into the school and then the fight stops. You have to fight to get into the school. You have to fight to stay into the school. You have to fight to graduate from the school. And they're going to make it as difficult as humanly possible.
You got to study.
Right, you have to study on top of all of that. As if studying by itself wasn't already a huge monumental task. You have to study and also deal with all the racism. So again, this is all just to highlight that there is a long, deep history of Black specific racism related to higher education. It has never in the history of this country been easy for Black students to get into higher ed. Yes.
So how did, I guess, members of the council interact with the description like WED board?
Sure.
How did those people manage to get in and through?
Well, so I'm not sure about W.E.D. Du Bois specifically, because I know first of all, I know he founded or was the president of one of the HBCU schools. But I do know that Martin Luther King went to an HBCU. So I'm going to assume, I don't know, this could be something that you guys look up. So for W.E.D. Du Bois, I don't know specifically, but yeah, you probably went to an HBCU if you went to higher ed, or you were the one kid in the classroom of all of the white students in a predominantly white university. Miss Lisa, you have a hand raised. Do you happen to know what happened to W.E.B. Du Bois?
Well, he was president. First of all, he was the first at Harvard, first psychologist that Harvard, first Black psychologist that Harvard graduated.
They did.
And
say that again for me, please.
He was the first Black psychologist that Harvard graduated.
I'm so sorry, Miss Lisa. I'm having a hard time hearing you. Would you do me a favor and type it in the chat? That would actually
Sure.
be really helpful.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So sorry, say that again.
RG Woodson,
Mm-hmm.
he graduated from the white university.
Yeah, again, just the one.
What's the point?
He would have been the just the one.
Right, gotcha.
Mm-hmm. That's the part of history that they fall into, where you got to go to a predominantly white university. You just got to be the one Black student in a classroom full of white students who probably had to do class in the hallway. So, sorry, question?
Want to go back, but I was convinced though, like, The question was, what about?
Maybe divorce, there were, there's something working. But, you know.
They went.
They were the only ones at.
Right, yeah, they are this person, the one, or they're this person, the one in the classroom. Yes,
Like, what comes to mind, not what, but why?
mm-hmm,
Because at the end of the day, like, what comes to mind is that it will have to be mobile. I mean, if it's good to accept it, there's a reason why it's accepted. Because that's
Sure.
alternative to the oath and all that stuff, like, you want to become president, like, why was Obama accepted at the time? he was accepted?
sure,
So, and then, like, one more thing that comes to mind that I wanted to, mention, I don't know if you know, but, Donald Trump, he did something with the APC, what was that? You know?
oh, I actually don't know what it
It just
is.
came to mind.
No, I totally understand why it came to mind, but I will assume probably a funding thing, but that's a little bit further back the line. So, sorry, anybody have any other questions before we move to? No, okay, cool. So we're moving to defining affirmative action as a term. So we didn't get affirmative action as an actual term until 1967. So imagine a world, JFK is president and he is hopefully possibly going to do something racial equality related, and he is giving a presidential executive order which talks about equal employment, which is pretty much the equality that we're talking about: equal employment, equal access to schools. All of those fall into the same category. And when he was creating this executive order, it was edited by a Black Texas lawyer named Hobart T. Taylor. So he added in the term affirmative action for the first time. So it was coined officially in this executive order, which was pretty cool. And then officially in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was signed and passed, when we start talking about equal employment and all of those parts of the Civil Rights Act, that is where affirmative action comes in officially in policy. So it's pretty cool. That's where we get our affirmative action from mostly. Oh yes, and there is a point in 1967 where President Johnson adds women to affirmative action. So affirmative action focused on race specifically in the beginning, and then they added gender as an additional thing. But what is affirmative action? So it is herein defined as a set of procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination among applicants, which should result in such prior discrimination being eliminated and preventing discrimination in the future. That's the point. And it's any application. So again, we're talking about jobs, we're talking about schools. If you are applying for something that receives federal funding or government assistance, then you should be allowed to be applying and enter into this workforce or enter into this university or whatever without discrimination based on your race. That is what affirmative action is here for. Oh, we have a question in the chat. Oh, W.E.B. Du Bois went to Fisk. There we go. And then Harvard afterwards. Thank you very much, Ms. Lisa, for answering that question. So doctorate from Harvard, but his original degree was from Fisk. Fisk is an HBCU. So he originally went to the HBCU and then became one Black person in a graduate program. So that's where we are with our affirmative action. So we've got it defined. We pretty much know what's going on. We feel like we've got a good grasp on the history so far. Yeah. All right. So, and there we go with President Johnson talking to Martin Luther King, hopefully doing something positive. But this is going to bring us to the first question I'm going to have you guys talk about. So we've got a couple of you guys. So I'd like you guys to break up by table or something, have a little bit of a discussion. I want you guys to ask yourselves, do you think affirmative action was a good solution to the problem that it was trying to solve? So affirmative action is trying to solve years of racism. Do you think that it did that effectively? So I'm going to give you guys 3 minutes or something. Please take a second, talk amongst yourselves in your groups. And then we'll come back together and I will ask you what you think. It is. Oh, yes. And everybody on Zoom, if you guys would like to speak amongst yourselves, and then in the chat, I will ask you guys what your opinions are right at the end.
I have just a quick question. While they're working, the students working, I'm curious, what grade level
Oh.
are they? What grade level are the students?
I'm so sorry, I'm having such a hard time hearing you. I'm just gonna use the chat.
Okay,
Well, it's definitely. Happening, it's just called in a different suit.
I'm gonna give you guys 1 more minute, just a 1 minute warning.
can you hear me, Mariana?
I mean, when we say like a Band-Aid, when I do like a fucking vaccine, not a lack of Band-Aid, but like a 49, showing Band-Aid. It's still like an underlying south, which is always be there, because it is so deep, like it is, like.
All right, everyone. I'm really sorry. I'm sure you guys are having fabulous discussions, but I'm going to stop us, bring us back in together. I apologize. I asked you a really deep question and then just. I'm so sorry.
We need part two.
I know. So I would love to go around and get some information from everybody about how you feel about this question, what solutions did you come up with? But I want to share one from the chat since it just came in. So from the chat, we have Miss Gloria, who said that affirmative action was a partial solution. I believe that colleges/universities were not so prepared to deal with the social challenges that Black students had to deal with once they got into universities. It's a great point, right? So we put in affirmative action, right? And we feel like we have the solution, but it wasn't super well thought out, right? It's just like the government going, and we're gonna just stop racism and discrimination, but without any real plan on how you're gonna do that, except integrating schools and jobs and calling it a day. So anybody else got any feels? How did you feel about this question? What did you come up with at your tables? Rosemary. Okay, you felt like it's the best solution that they could have come up with. All right. Mm.
They're.
Gotcha. So you feel like affirmative action gave Black people more options in the United States? Sure, better chance. Great.
I agree. That was actually
Mm.
the first time a Black person was admitted. With motor schools, they're on the first.
Mm-hmm.
They were just waiting for that situation to happen. When it did happen. And I think they were probably surprised that we didn't do it.
Mm.
Affirmative action was still in place. I think that when it comes to playing politics, I think that the Democrats still have a lot to learn from the Republicans in terms of standing the ground,
Mm.
for lack of a better expression. And when things are put forth, we're not, and because we're so intent on these laws, we want to see happen.
Right.
It's like we never consider, well, what if this?
Mm-hmm.
What if that?
Sure.
And let's see, can we figure out a solution to these things before we even go further?
Sure. Excellent. So I think you and Ms. Gloria are making some similar points, right? Where you we have this huge goal that we're trying to meet with affirmative action, but no real idea of how we're going to get the steps. And you're saying that there are some obvious issues with affirmative action, right? You got to expect that a white person is going to challenge us and call it reverse racism, right? But for some reason, we just weren't prepared for that.
And because everything was labeled in terms of black and white,
Mm-hmm.
the other ethnic minorities weren't even considered.
Sure.
And I hear, well, a lot of them work with a lot of people, Chinese and Japanese,
Native American.
you got American Indians, you got Hispanic. But they weren't even part of the equation at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was strictly in terms of black and white.
Sure.
Okay, being a black person, hell, you know, but on the one thing. But there again, on the other hand, all of these learned people who have gone through law school. And they come up with all of these scenarios in order to graduate from law school.
Mm-hmm.
But what is? It's like none of that was ever considered. And how do we kind of anticipate, at least anticipate,
Sure.
and to be able to prepare what that result
Should
is
look.
going to be.
Mm-hmm. That's a good
Um,
point. Carrie Ann, sorry, do you have a hand up?
yeah, I just wanted to follow what they said, and I was kind of it's kind of abandoned. If I was stopping different social wasn't fully old.
Sure, and that's important, right? To acknowledge that affirmative action, while a positive thing, is very much like you said, it's like a Band-Aid, right? You still haven't solved the root problem. You've solved one of the problems, right? And that's kind of important. We need to make sure that we're acknowledging that that's in there. Oh, and we've got some stuff from the chat. Give me just a second.
This is a deep question.
It is, it's a
You
deep
can
question.
have a whole day, come back.
We could, so we have Miss Lisa from the chat. I want to make sure that I'm reading everybody's responses. So Miss Lisa says that it was progress from where we were at the time. And it's important to put in context, as Miss Gloria points out, but interestingly enough, more energy was put into the concern of white students as opposed to Black students. That's a very good point, where we were so concerned about how this would affect white students, and we didn't really think about what this meant for Black students or how they were going to have to deal with that, right? So that's a really good one.
I do think it's going back to what the young lady said, a Band-Aid solution. And I do think, as you mentioned, I believe the time period has a lot to do with it. I think that, basically, white people were not prepared for the outcry. This was not something they gave us. Okay, the bottom line was we were not being educated.
Sure.
People. The HBCUs, the four Black institutions in the South, most of your prominent leaders came out of those institutions.
Right.
Okay, so they succeeded
Mhm.
in spite of
All of the challenges.
So it's a trick question to me.
Ah, okay.
I'm also, I'm living in a product like we open enrollment because African American students in New York City to integrate the school system here.
Ah, okay.
I never paid attention to it before,
Sure, you were a kid.
but because it all again it goes back to who benefits. Now, granted, the All Black school that I attended was basically, the teachers were all of European descent. Many of us were failing badly. My mother tried to look for a way to galvanize the Black talents, and they weren't interested. So she took advantage of the program. Now, did I benefit? Yes, because I was 3 years behind the leader. But
Okay.
at the same time, were issues regarding my community, my identity as a person of African descent. No, we were nowhere in the picture, just like we're trying to do the all white books again,
Right.
okay? So it really has a lot to do with identity. Obama raises the fact that, you know, she got involved in it, and in many cases, she was looked down upon. I mean, that's what Clarence Thomas is part of it. You know, I still wasn't considered either way he wasn't on.
I mean.
To make us people, if you come back to what you said, the little Band-Aid thing to say, you know, we're gonna fix it a little bit for right now. That was
Sure.
1961 that this Black man came up, and I wasn't aware of, I didn't mention this,
Sure.
but he tried, and he's good. Not on my feeling, because I wasn't there, so.
Right.
You know, but, it is a true question, and I think, whatever way we got through school, we have to appreciate the fact that we did.
Right.
But now we gotta figure out how we're gonna address it.
Excellent. So yes, thank you. That was really good. It is kind of a trick question, right? Asking whether or not affirmative action solved the problem. Because we still have to contextualize the problem, right? And the problem is going to be different for every student who experiences it. And just because there is a problem doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge the wonderful people who made it through, even with all of the obstacles that they had to overcome. Obviously, that's an amazing thing, right? To have gone to school and had all of these issues and still be able to, you know, cross those hurdles and leave with a degree. So that is very important. So definitely we should take a second, acknowledge that that's happened and that's beautiful and they managed to make it through, and also still be thinking as we move forward, how can we make it easier for people to do that so that we don't all have to jump through those same hurdles, so that we're trying to create a solution where it's easier for students of color to get a degree in higher education. So I'm so sorry, I'm gonna stop us there and then move us to the next thing, but I want to check the chat really quick because I feel like there was something in here. Okay, so Miss Gloria came in again. Thank you, Miss Gloria. So over the years, colleges have developed more programs that support the needs of their Black students and enhance their success, but it was a long time coming and overcame as a result of Black advocacy. Yes, we advocate for ourselves and create our own solutions. We are good at doing that. But it is important to make sure that we are in a legal space in the United States where you are able to come up with those solutions and make those changes for yourself. So just thank you. So sorry, guys. I know we still have a lot of feels. Oh, really quick, just one.
So I think that it is a solution to a problem in that campuses were not diverse in vote.
Mhm.
And so if for no other reason, and I'm not trying to, you will address the benefits to black people, but it also created diversity on campuses. So now you have, white people who have mixed maybe in quote, with people of color. It's that we actually created was good for the, this is beneficial for the country because we didn't have these all white, contracts.
That's actually an awesome point. I'm so glad that you brought that up. So we will be talking about that a little bit further in the discussion, where we will talk about whether or not Black students or a diverse campus offers something positive for the student body of any university or college. We are going to address that. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I think it's a really good point. I personally am of the opinion that having a diverse campus is very helpful, but don't worry, we gonna talk about this. It's gonna come up again. So, all right, let's get into race conscious admissions. So very quickly, you will find that saying the words affirmative action became a problem in the United States. As soon as you say the words affirmative action, anyone who's not Black takes that as, oh, a Black person got a spot based on no merit, which is a ridiculous notion, but doesn't mean that that's not what we had to deal with, right? So raise of hands if you've heard something like, oh, you're only here because of a quota, or because affirmative action put you here, or you don't deserve to be here and have this opportunity because affirmative action put you here. We ever heard something like that? Yeah, we heard this before.
A lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs where a coworker would tell you, you don't belong to be here. You got here because affirmative action put you here. So there is this running idea in the United States that because affirmative action exists, there are Black people in positions of jobs or in universities or in schools who do not deserve to be there. So it's a pervasive myth. We will talk about it a little bit more later, but I just want to make sure that we are all sitting with that information as we move forward with this discussion. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is quotas. So there used to be the idea of a quota associated to affirmative action, where a certain number of spots in a job or university would be held for students of color. So for example, in a university, if you've got 150 students, 10 of them have to be Black students, right? That's what a quota system would look like. And there's this idea that we've always had a quota system, or that quota systems are a thing, but we actually don't have them and never really had them as it relates to affirmative action. So again, affirmative action doesn't really become a thing until 1964, right? When we have the Civil Rights Act officially get put in place. There may have been some quotas a bit earlier than that. I believe I talked to you guys about pre-segregation, during segregation, when schools were segregated. If you were in a school in the North, you may have been in a school where they had a quota of Black students. But again, that's pre-Civil Rights Act. Post-Civil Rights Act, what you get almost immediately is this case, University of California v. Bakke, which I believe you talked about before. So clearly we are aware that this case exists. But the important part of this case was that it upheld that the use of race as one of the factors in choosing qualified applicants for admissions is fine. So there were several challenges similar to what we were talking about, where, someone will come up to you in a university and say, you don't deserve to be here. You're only here because you're Black, and they have affirmative action quotas. And what schools actually had was something closer to race conscious admissions, which means there's no set space, there's no set number of Black students they're trying to get. They are looking at your admission and they're seeing that there is a Black student, and instead of viewing that as a negative, they're viewing it as a positive, which was totally fine. This case also did hold, though, that if you have a quota system, that is illegal. So 1978, very specifically in a Supreme Court case, we got, hey, no quotas, we are not allowed to do that. So totally fine. Then we move on a little bit to 1996, where we have Hopwood v. Texas. This was a federal case, so not a Supreme Court case, Texas federal, where a school's policy basically was held unconstitutional because it had a threshold for minority applicants. This was closer to a quota system where you have a certain number of students of color that you're trying to have in your school. So if you have something that's a quota system, that's not okay. We're just making sure that we're driving that point home. And then in 2003, we once again talk about in the Supreme Court, we talk once again about quota systems, and just to make sure that we know this one for sure, it's totally fine to have an admission system where minority applicants, you look at their race and you again view it as a positive, you give them a point for it or something like that. But if you, so again, if you're doing a quota system, not okay. But if you're just looking at race as one of several factors of the student, totally fine. What else? I feel like there was something else in here that was kind of important. No? Oh, only that we're talking about compelling interest, right? This is going to become important later. So this is where we start to look at the compelling interest of having race be something that you consider in your students. So compelling interest is just saying that the state has an interest in having a diverse campus, or there is something beneficial about having a diverse campus. So what we are going to do is we are going to watch this really cool video so that I can stop talking about affirmative action. So let's get into that. Hopefully everybody can hear.
Now, when I was in high school, affirmative action just seemed like some buzzword from back in the day. But when me and my friends actually started applying to college, it was something that came up a lot. Affirmative action is back in the news, and this time Harvard is getting sued. Now, usually these types of lawsuits make the claim that when race is considered in college admissions, white people are unfairly discriminated against. So this lawsuit is claiming Asian Americans are the ones being hurt by these policies. Plot twist. So while this lawsuit against Harvard has a new angle, it really does boil down to an age-old debate over affirmative action. Should race be a factor in college admissions? Okay, so when it comes to college admissions, affirmative action refers to policies where race and gender are considered in the application process. Now, they're not the only thing that colleges are looking at. They're still looking at your grades, your SAT score, extracurricular activities, all that good stuff. But they also take into account your race and gender in an effort to help ensure that women and minorities are getting equal access to higher education. The idea was born out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s as a way to help counter the longstanding racist and sexist barriers that kept minorities and women out of elite universities. Barriers like, I don't know, the fact that women couldn't get a degree from Harvard until 1963, or the idea that people of color weren't as smart as white people. The 60s were messed up, man. We needed rules to help. Some see affirmative action as kind of like counterbalance to legacy admission policy, which is when applicants get preferential treatment if someone in their family attended the school, a perk that tends to benefit wealthy white applicants, since they were the only ones getting into these elite schools in the first place. And to be clear, affirmative action isn't always about race. It's definitely helped a lot of white women, but now that co-ed is kind of the norm, the controversy is almost always over race. And over the years, there's been a stream of lawsuits challenging, mostly from people who feel they've been unfairly rejected because of race. The most recent being is Harvard. So let's take a look at both sides of the argument. Those in favor of affirmative action see it as a way to fight long-standing discrimination when it comes to educational opportunities. They think it's necessary in making sure that minorities with good academic standing have access to higher education. And there's some data to support this. 8 states have essentially banned affirmative action practices and instead have what's known as race-blind admission policies. So the New York Times looked at admissions data from public universities in a bunch of those states, and they found that when schools got rid of affirmative action, there was a dip in Black and Latino students, even as their populations grew. But it wasn't true for every university and state. In fact, Florida has actually done a pretty good job of keeping its enrollment of Black and Latino students at pace with the population, despite getting rid of affirmative action. Yep, you heard me right. That was Florida, the same Florida that brings you headlines like these. Affirmative action advocates also point out that a more diverse campus benefits everyone, not just the students it's specifically designed to help. With the diverse student body, all students learn valuable interpersonal skills outside of the classroom, like how to interact and respect people that are different from you. Skills that set you up for a successful life in a diverse world. Now, that doesn't mean that being nice to people of color is gonna get you a lot of money, but who knows? And then once you get into the real world, there's evidence that diverse teams make better decisions and are actually even more profitable to businesses. So maybe I was wrong. But if you're on the other side of this argument, we don't see affirmative action that way. Many opponents believe that affirmative action policies are themselves discriminatory and can actually create racial tension. They say that qualified candidates end up getting rejected from schools while less qualified minority applicants get accepted for the sake of diversity. They even have a term for this, reverse discrimination. And at elite schools, less qualified can be the difference between perfect SAT scores and getting one question wrong. And this discrimination is kind of what the Harvard lawsuit is all about. The plaintiffs are essentially claiming that Harvard is holding Asian Americans to a higher standard because they don't want too many getting in compared to other groups. And the argument goes, this can hurt race relations. If people are assuming that minority students are only at a school because they got special treatment, then those students might not be seen as equals in the eyes of the professors and their peers, even if they would have gotten in without affirmative action. And that doesn't exactly create an environment of inclusiveness. Some opponents say that instead of being race-based, affirmative action should be class-based. That way, a student of a single white mom from Appalachia or a low-income Asian immigrant family will get a leg up. Then you're not actively hurting poor whites or Asians. And of course, there are other opponents that think even that's too far and just want college admissions to be based on merit, like looking at your test scores and your GPA. There's also the argument that affirmative action isn't even really working. According to another New York Times analysis, admissions of Black and Latino students is still lacking at many top universities. And instead of focusing efforts on affirmative action policies, some opponents think that we should tackle the problems that both low income and students of color face early in the education system. Problems like lack of resources or advanced courses. That way, we set students up for success from the beginning. So the debate over affirmative action has been raging for years, and Americans are pretty split on the issue. It brings up some great questions about what we value as a society and how we ensure equality. Now, I know you all have some opinions about this. So should race be a factor in college admissions? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of college admission, you should check out this video we did on SAT.
So, hang on, let me get us off this. All right. So before we get into our myths about affirmative action, how do we feel about that video? Anything, you hear stuff that was familiar?
I like the part that, go into, we looking at affirmative action. like,
Mhm.
school.
Okay.
I think for the most part, definition, absolutely, should not be looked at as, absolutely.
Mhm.
And definitely should not be looked at as, in terms of socioeconomic status, I think that's the number one thing.
Okay, so looking at socioeconomic status over looking at race.
Right, I mean, one goes with the other, of course, but at the same time, college is really, if you think about it, college is a privileged thing,
Sure.
in the sense of, if you've never heard about it, if no one in your family ever went to it, why would you go to it?
Sure.
And it's, have higher education, something of a privilege matter. So you have to look at it in context of someone who isn't always privileged.
Right.
So that's why I like how you brought up admissions into that.
Right, where we start looking at kids when they're really young and make sure that they're set up for success so that later they end up in these higher
Yeah.
education institutes on their own without it having to be race related. That's cool. So anybody else got feelings about the video before we move into? Yeah. Hmm? If it's not race, it's gonna be your zip code. That's that's a good point. So this is another part of the Band-Aid thing, right? Racism is so entrenched in our American society and so untreated that really, honestly, everything is touched by race. You're not gonna find something where race doesn't also play a factor. So your socioeconomic status, race will play a factor. Your zip code, race will play a factor. Anything that you can name also has something associated with it that is going to be racial, just given the history of America. So it's really, again, it's why when we talk about affirmative action, it's supposed to be an equal rights thing, right? It's equal rights for everybody. So it's a gender thing. It's a sexual orientation thing. It's a religion thing. And yet we only ever seem to have the fight about race.
It's gonna get worse before it gets better.
It is hard to maintain white superiority when other people show up and they're just as good as you are. Tough. Sorry, carry on, go ahead.
I would like the idea of marriage, but I can see where it becomes controversial when I think of like. People that have a certain grade disability or like.
Mhm.
Something social that comes back. We're not being aware of certain things that people, even if we were to move on their basis of stuff. Or basically about it.
Sure.
I mean, you could take race out of it, but it's still cause.
Mhm. And again, that brings up our racism elephant in the room, right? We can try to address affirmative action through a bunch of other things that aren't race related. Merit is honestly a great system if you're trying to grab the students who have the best grades. What could possibly be wrong with that? The fact that we still haven't addressed racism is the problem. So even if, you make such an excellent point. If you are Black and disabled, are you going to have as good grades as somebody who's white and disabled? Probably not, because we still haven't addressed the racism in America, right? So until we get that core thing addressed, it's gonna be really hard to just be like, well, we'll just flip gears to something else, to merit-based or to socioeconomic or whatever else. So very important points. I'm very glad that we brought that up, but let's move into the myth busting section of this because I thought that this was really important. And the video brought up a lot of really good things, right? So we looked at the pro view for affirmative action. We looked at the con views for affirmative action. And I thought it would be really important for us to talk about some of the myths associated with affirmative action and just sort of get those out of the way. So affirmative action only benefits Black people. Myth. Right? We always have the argument around race, and the argument generally is centered around Black people, because again, treated racism in this country is a pretty big problem. But the people who've actually benefited the most from affirmative action is white women. They got into the most schools and the most jobs post affirmative action comparative to everyone else. So it is not something that only benefits Black people. And again, of course, affirmative action is something that's for everyone. So affirmative action has been used to help Asian people get into things. It has been used to help Latino people get into things. It has helped Native American people get into things. It has helped LGBTQ people get into things. It has helped Jewish people get into things because we have a bias in America towards Catholicism, which is very interesting. Oh, sorry, not Catholicism, it's Protestant, but you know what I mean. Sorry, Christianity over everything else. So all of these groups have benefited from affirmative action. It is certainly not something that only benefits Black people. So, myth. Another prevailing myth, affirmative action is no longer needed in America because equal opportunity prevails. How do we feel about that?
The only thing that's equal is when you wait on that line at the grocery store. That's the only thing that's equal. That's the only line. That's the only, we all wait on that one and get checked out. That's it.
We're all equal in grocery store lines, but other than that, absolutely not. Yeah, there's still persistent issues with race in America. There was an article not too long ago about how schools in New York City specifically are some of the most segregated schools in the country. Segregation is supposed to be over, and yet we still segregate schools, specifically if they're those standardized high schools that you have to test into. And this again pushes that prevailing myth that Black kids are somehow less than, or they're not smart enough to get into these schools. That's absolutely not true. We have this wonderful little pipeline system where if you live in a certain area code, you and your kid or whatever's going on over there, your kid in middle school is more likely to get test prep for the SATs or for whatever standardized test they have to take when they get in. If you are a kid who happens to live in a Black zip code, you will probably see that test for the first time when you take it. Obviously, that's not going to serve you very well, right? We have a similar problem with SAT scores. We've noticed that kids in certain zip codes do better on the SATs. Why? Is it because white and Asian children are smarter? Absolutely not. It is because their schools give them access to test prep before they take the test. And Black kids who have to take the same test generally see that test for the first time when you take it. So this is actually a great question for the room. Anybody have to take the SAT?
Question is, how come?
Hmm?
How come in Black communities?
Oh, because we're Black. That's a resource. If you have resources to allocate, you're gonna give them to the Black kids, not in racist America.
But in certain neighborhoods with certain groups of people, they provide their own test prep. They have all kinds of after school programs that they make sure that the kids are getting that test prep. But in the Asian community, they have test prep going on from probably in the school. And so it's not, I don't think it's fair to say it's the system necessarily.
Mhm.
This test prep. So I think some responsibility does remain with the community, like, what do you do in order to make sure your kid is fully fed?
Sure.
Now, when you look at those exams, the information about the exams, they get all kinds of information out within those booklets. They're telling you, this is where you can get the sample test and blah, blah. So if we're not accessing that, then we start as possible. Whose fault is that?
Sure.
And I don't know, if you can give you the answer.
But that is a good point to throw in there, right? It's important to prioritize these things in your own communities, right? So while there's definitely a disadvantage when it comes to the allocation of resources, it's also important if you know that that's happening, and we're all Black in America. We know that we're not getting the resources that we need. So if you know your kid's not going to have access to those resources, try to find them on your own. Make sure your kid is getting test prep. You know your kid has to take the SATs. Try to make sure that they get test prep for that before they go. But clearly, parents in other communities are making that choice for themselves, right? Where you have Asian students who are working in their community and doing the test prep in their community. So that's gotta be something that you try to prioritize. Yes.
When it comes to, I guess, the community or as families stepping in to kind of bridge that, where they're not aware of these kind of resources, and these types of things, I think it also falls the parents in a sense, in that they're not, maybe some mindset thing. That's what they might not be, or they might have this time to do some. And then put the extra work instead of help.
Yep.
Sometimes I'm also not even disclosed for that. They want water hours.
Mhm.
People that also have to do. But I do think, like in my, for me, when I was doing or my mom was the one that even told me how this special.
Sure.
Find classes and stuff to do. And I don't know, I'm looking back to it now, I didn't necessarily realize that there were a lot of foods that I had supposed to be granted such an opportunity, and at the same time, I definitely didn't feel kind of less than in the process, realizing that, yeah, I'm not to do it twice as much.
Yep.
Kind of use more.
Yeah.
In terms of the parents in the community, I think that's what.
Absolutely.
To your point, to both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Also, when there are Black educators in the schools, it's their responsibility to raise, to me, the guidance counselors, how come kids aren't being given this amount of information? Because it's part of our responsibility to stay on top as well. And going back to what you mentioned, I worked in the district where I was in 29,
Mhm.
and the superintendent set up a meeting. A specialized, high school, it's not Stuyvesant, it's the other one.
Sure.
Technical, Brooklyn Tech.
Uh-huh.
And the principal there at that time was African American.
Sure.
And he mentioned to the principal there that parent orientation in the beginning of the year is packed with Asian parents.
Mm,
They bring their interpreters, because many of them can't speak English.
sure.
They pay for these people to be present
Mhm.
so that they can get the information regarding one college,
Right.
starting in the 9th grade. Okay, so when they're in the high school. It really, there are other principals, for instance, I taught in PS 40 under Dr. Shirley Roach,
Mhm.
and we started college prep philosophy in kindergarten.
Sure.
We started telling our kids in kindergarten, you can go to college,
Mhm.
and providing people to make that possible.
Right.
So it goes back to community, it goes back to your commitment as an educator,
Right.
and this is part of community activity.
That's really good. Yeah, you got, this is a good community activism thing for you to be working on, figuring out what's going on with your kids, making sure that they have test prep together, making sure that they're taking advantage of these opportunities when they can, because there are parents who are making those decisions. So that's really good. I wanted to make sure that I read some stuff from the chat, just to make sure that we're all participating, because I saw some really good stuff in here. So Miss Lisa came in, school segregation is in large part due to redlining. That is true. We had redlining in America. The amount of money that your school gets is based on the amount of taxes that your homes bring in. And if you live in a red line district, congratulations, your school is going to be terrible. The resources at your school are going to be really bad. And the people who live there are going to be black. Those are the rules of redlining. So redlining does have a lot to do with how much resources are allocated to your kid as a student. And just to where you live and what sort of other minorities that you get to live in. Asian kids have the benefit of not having to live in redline neighborhoods. This is not to say that they don't deal with discrimination. It's just saying that that specific type of discrimination wasn't made for them. Yes.
Know why they have districts on to the school and why they do that. Is another someone that I can see, but
Probably, my understanding of school district lines is that it's very similar to political lines. If you ever heard of something called gerrymandering, where they draw a district line so weird because they know certain groups of people live in certain places. And if you draw the district weird, then you'll get to make sure that if there's a certain number of blue votes that, you know, in this particular area, you just group them with a larger number of red votes, then you never have to worry about anything liberal or democratic happening in that specific spot.
it goes back to her comment as well, it's political.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of time,
Pizza.
the money that they put in. You have some school districts, the parents are wealthy, and they pump money into it.
They most certainly do.
They buy their teachers,
Mhm.
they buy some.
And you, as an African-American person, are unlikely to have the same opportunity. There's a huge wealth disparity in the United States. But I want to finish this one last myth, and then I'm going to pause this because pizza just showed up. So let's get through this very last myth, and then we'll do a little pizza break. Last myth, affirmative action should be about class and not about race. So we have talked about this just briefly a second ago. We were talking about if you address class, you might also address the race problem. So why don't we just do that? Well, the reason why we don't do that is because as much as colorblindness sounds nice, race is actually a problem in America. It's nice to say that we're all the same and color doesn't matter, but we have years and years of history and policy and law in America that says otherwise. It says that it's totally cool to treat you differently based on your color. And because we have that history, it would be unwise to avoid that history just because it's uncomfortable and we would like to live under a set of guidelines that makes us believe that America is colorblind. We might be moving towards a colorblind America. That could be a great goal for us down the line, but it's not where we are right this second. And it's important to make sure that we recognize that. So I'm going to pause right here for about 5 minutes. Everybody, you're in the room, please go grab some pizza. Everybody who is not in the room, I'm sorry, we're gonna pause for a second. Please feel free to do a bathroom break, grab some water, all of that other stuff. And we will see you in 5 minutes.
Mariana, can you hear me okay?
And it's shiny and happy to see some young, like me.
Trying to make that change. One weekend at a time.
One weekend at a time. All right, pizza. There's pizza. I was really excited about it. Undergrad, environmental policy and anthropology, grad school environmental law.
And you have to be involved with something, because you just so confident.
It makes me very happy.
But yeah, we are ready to determine. And we'll like that, get us like,
Not yet, but I'm going to. Yeah, it's not great. Every time the Supreme Court has a session, I prepare myself to be sad. Sure.
Later on.
It's hard. Even after. Mm-hmm.
And it's the culture where on budget.
Yep. It's the cognitive dissonance of America. We don't like to talk about that history. We like to pretend that that didn't happen, but and that's another reason why I'm not, or at least I try really hard not to be critical of Black people when I see them not doing something that other minorities are doing. So similar, Asian parents spend a lot of time making sure that their kids get tutors and they have test prep and all that other stuff. They are able to do that. It's totally fine for them. We're still, like, I don't blame you if you're a Black parent and you just finished, dealing with Jim Crow was 2 seconds ago. If you grew up during Jim Crow and your main concern is my kid going to live today? I can see why wondering whether or not your kid has test prep isn't on your list. Mm-hmm. Yes.
University. But now, we had this, and the different man was these folks have even come here, they have like 3 months to get a job for education, but we are under the illusion that everybody here is reading, they know.
Mm-hmm.
They know that. Okay.
It's a very different history, which is actually a great segue. We are going to get back into this. I see that we're all pretty much back in our seats with pizza, which is beautiful. Please don't feel like you have to talk. I'm just going to talk at you while you guys eat. Please take your time. Don't worry about anything. So I'm just going to move us back in. I have a couple more myths for us to debunk real quick, and then we're just going to move from there. So, we've actually already addressed this one, so this one's pretty easy, but affirmative action programs are quota-based. We've already talked about this. It is literally illegal for things to be quota-based via the Supreme Court as of the 1970s. So we don't have quota systems. Those are not real. So anytime you hear somebody go, oh, you're one of the 5 Black kids that's supposed to be here, we don't have those. So it's literally unconstitutional. That's not a thing. And affirmative action is reverse discrimination, right? We've heard this one before, where we are, by having affirmative action, you're discriminating against other people. And I think there's something really important for us to look at here, and that's kind of the mindset that we have as Americans. So as Americans, I feel like we generally see resources as like a piece of a pie, right? And in order for someone to get more pie, someone else has to get less, right? That's the way pie works. It is a finite space. We don't really have to look at resources like that. And we very particularly don't have to look at education like that. Education doesn't have to be something in America where because somebody got an education, that means somebody else didn't get an education. That's really not how that works, right? Even if you don't get into the school that you wanted to, it doesn't mean that you didn't get into school, right? So somebody at a school who's trying to promote diversity, who gives a Black kid a spot, does not mean that the white kid who wanted to get into that school and didn't get into that school no longer gets to go to school. You just go to a different school. It's not that big of a deal. It's not, there's not this conspiracy for reverse discrimination. And also, an important thing to note here is that when we talk about reverse discrimination or reverse racism in specific, we are talking about something systematic, right? So something that's huge, part of a system, and has historically disadvantaged something. White people are not historically disadvantaged in higher education institutions. As a matter of fact, they generally have legacies, which for some reason will make up for, in some cases, a good 40% of the students who are admitted into schools. They're admitted because someone who they're related to went to and graduated from that school a long time ago. And those people are going to be mostly white people because the majority of these institutions from their founding were only letting in white students, right? So your legacy students aren't brown. You didn't let brown kids into your school until maybe at best when the Civil Rights Act hit in the 1960s. Until then, you were keeping your school segregated. You weren't integrating your school. So I just want to very firmly make sure that we are all on the same page here, that white students didn't have to deal with an abundance of discrimination. And having Black kids in your school does not mean that you as a white student are being discriminated against. And again, we really got to work on that mindset where we see everything as a piece of a pie, where you have to take resources from somebody to give resources to somebody else. We have enough resources for everyone who wants to go to college in the United States to be able to go to a college, all right? I understand that a lot of people have like one school that they've really got in their mind that you really want to go to. I'm so sorry, we don't all get into our dream school, but you can absolutely get an education in America, and affirmative action does nothing to hinder you from getting an education. So just want to make sure we're all working on that same thing. And some interesting facts that I came across as I was going through, in 2006, we did see that there was a slight close of the racial gap in SAT college admissions. So that's pretty cool. And then we also had a thing where a couple of schools started to drop the SAT requirements, and we saw that more Black students actually ended up in schools once you drop SAT requirements. Go figure. So again, this is one of those things where I'm like, it's really hard for people to look me in the eye and tell me that the SAT scores isn't a race thing. If you get rid of SAT scores and immediately there's more Black kids in school, it's a race thing. So just wanted to make sure that we had that out there. All right. Oh, and then another fun fact, 2006 was the year where the highest number of African Americans earning bachelor's degrees was ever recorded in the nation's history. So hey, we peaked in 2006. All right, so now we are going to move into one of our 2003 cases. So this one's a big one. It's Grutter v. Bollinger. This is the 2003 case. What happened was there was a student named Barbara Grutter, sorry, I'm gonna mess up her name, but Barbara Grutter applied to University of Michigan Law School. She had a 3.8 GPA and her LSAT score was a 161, which I'm here to tell you is average. Most of your Ivy League schools will ask you to be 170 at the lowest. Anything under Ivy League will probably ask you to be somewhere close to 165. So her scores were big. She did not get in, and she decided that the reason that she didn't get in was because her spot had been given to an undeserving Black student who probably had lower scores than her and was only allowed in because of affirmative action. Again, we have already debunked this myth, but that doesn't mean that you can't sue for it. So she filed suit. It gets all the way to the Supreme Court, where they consider whether or not looking at the race of the applicant is something that's okay. And in a very narrow 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court found that the school's admissions process was okay because it was narrowly tailored. Now, what that means is that they are allowing you to look at a student's race as long as you're doing it on a very specific case-by-case basis, right? So again, you don't want to get close to quotas where you go, oh, a Black student, I'll just take this one. But if you're looking at the student and you go, well, they have really great grades, they have really great SAT scores, they have really great everything else, and also they happen to be a Black student, okay, we'll take this student. That is fine. You are totally allowed to do that. That is not a problem. So that is what the Supreme Court held here in 2003. Again, the reasoning is that it's a highly individualized review of each applicant. You're not accepting or rejecting someone automatically based on their race. So because it's narrowly tailored, because it's so specific, they were like, yeah, this is fine. It's not going to be a problem. An important note for this case, though, is that one of the Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor, expressly mentioned that she believed that 25 years from now, using racial preferences for schools will no longer be necessary. So this is in 2003. So basically she's saying by 2028, we'll have fixed racism by doing this amount of affirmative action this way. So 25 years from now, this will be cool. We won't need this anymore. And so post this case, most schools adopted a similar sort of review where you look at students on a case-by-case basis and you do consider their race, but you consider it holistically along with everything else. So that's pretty much how we get to where we are. I want to say today, but honestly not anymore. Back in my day when I was going to school, this was the formula that we used. So hang on one second. There we go. Oh, yes. And here is the makeup of our Supreme Court at the time of this decision. And if you're wondering who Judge O'Connor was, she is the lady with the ruffles sitting right there. So we move on from here and we have Fisher v. University of Texas. It is much the same as the last case. There was a student named Fisher. She didn't have the scores and didn't get into University of Texas, and she was not a huge fan. We're actually going to watch a video that explains the case a little bit more, but I wanted to just make sure that I gave you guys some basic information about how it worked. So again, we're talking about the 14th Amendment gives us equal protection under the law, and the student here alleged that the white student who didn't get into University of Texas said that if a Black student got in her place, that means that she is not equally protected under the 14th Amendment. And here, there was a standard of strict scrutiny that was held up for the case. And the court basically said that they reviewed everything and the university's policy is fine and is necessary to achieve benefits of diversity on their campus. So that's pretty much how that one went. I wanted to point this out just because it infuriates me, and I wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page when we talk about Justice Clarence Thomas. He wrote that there is nothing necessary about the benefits that flow from racial diversity in higher education. So there is no compelling interest for the state to promote. Basically, he's saying nothing good happens from diversity on campuses, and therefore states shouldn't be able to use that as an excuse to look at race during a student's application process. So that's a thing that got said. But let us watch this video so that we can see what happened in this case.
One of the most controversial.
I'm sorry, say that again. So for this particular case, so the last one, Brutter, she didn't get into the law school. She was not accepted and then sued because she didn't get in. Fisher was a similar thing. She didn't get in and then sued because she didn't get into the school. Funnily enough, though, the case that we're going to look at, the Harvard case that destroys affirmative action, the student who sued got waitlisted for Harvard. So he was not rejected from the school. He just was waitlisted and then sued anyway. So, all right, let's get into this one, though. This is Fisher v. University of Texas, 2013.
Controversial topics today is affirmative action in higher education. What role, if any, should a college applicant's race play in a public university's decision to admit or reject the applicant? In 2013, the United States Supreme Court addressed this issue in Fisher versus University of Texas. Abigail Fisher, a white high school student in Texas, applied for admission into the University of Texas at Austin, which admitted only a fraction of its applicants. The university had a two-tiered admission policy. Under the first tier, which covered 75% of admitted students, any high school senior in Texas who ranked high in his or her class, typically in the top 7th or 8%, automatically would be admitted into the university if they applied. Under the second tier, for the remaining quarter of admitted students, the university took a holistic approach to assessing students and assigned to students both an academic index and a personal achievement index. That dual approach considered not only academic achievements, but also applicants' essays and a wide variety of personal achievements and circumstances. The latter included leadership activities, work experiences, coming from a low-income home, and an applicant's race, with a minority student's race typically increasing that student's score. The university designed the second tier based on the Supreme Court's decisions in Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger. The expressed goal of the university's admission policy, including its second tier, was to increase the diversity of its student body. Fisher, who applied for admission under the university's second tier process, was denied admission. She filed a federal lawsuit contending that the university's second tier admissions process violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment based on its consideration of an applicant's race. The district court upheld the university's policy as constitutional. On Fisher's appeal, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit affirmed the district court's judgment. Although the appeals court stated that it was engaging in strict scrutiny of the university's admissions policy, the court afforded deference both to the university's decision to consider diversity as the basis for its race-based policy and the university's specific manner of considering an applicant's race. Fisher successfully petitioned the United States Supreme Court to review her case.
All right, and that's it. That was just.
One of the
gave
most
us- Okay, it just gave us some really good background, but we know how that case ended. The Supreme Court ended up holding up that decision. And said that the school's policy was fine. It did have some issues with the strict scrutiny used by the lower court systems, but that's a little bit of a separate thing. So we're gonna stop there, do another question session real quick. So again, I'm gonna have you guys take about 3 minutes. You guys can do tables. And again, everybody online, please feel free to speak to each other. But so for this one, do you think that this era had a positive or negative impact on diversity in higher education? So go ahead, discuss. How do you feel? Take your 3 minutes. This era meaning race conscious admissions as opposed to quotas or anything that actually has the word affirmative action attached to it.
Maybe like 5 minutes or 2 extra minutes.
Sure. Go ahead.
So, okay, so look at the problem, I just think backwards and forward. So I look at the problem, look at the back. So the question to be asked is, how would that make people again now? So it's shifted with the time. The plan is to make the applicants of admissions diversified. So when we still, yeah. Their goal was what. That was definitely, but you had, for 25% people that did, 25% that help, that's why we, people didn't want to. That was sort of like, the first one, as other factors, right? So I think we're more likely to find people with habit, and it's about that, and that's just like, I wouldn't be green. But I have to say that they can't score as high as people who did in that 25%. But back on hand, with all that being said, that on it, they got those issues are going to diversify. Diversify the pool. Because if you just, I mean, based on for the long where people are just getting into store. People are not going to make store for they are. Not only that, but it's just, and I look at them who are involved, yes, we've people that, we've already people that can think through that, strategize and plan that before you even get those people, you're excluding a whole bunch of other people want to have those skills. So that's when they are avoiding. When you're work with this enrollment, not to the person that comes to get school because you're not doing that. And one, you don't want to. But like we have a trust, they're going back, yes, the goal is not, and I hear. Could there be a police probably of white people? I think that would be, 25% from and I'm. It's hard. Sometimes people need to share. People need to. Sometimes people are for the fact that they're able to organize and package, given their background, that is helpful. Like our auditors, it's very hard. Adults, on different generations. That's the first time where they have to because
Everybody, I'm gonna give you a 1 minute warning, 1 more minute.
these questions are very like.
I know. Sorry. I'm trying. I know. It's a lot.
Think about it. People are there. And then reply to in the back of my mind. Why do this? So it's like people from. If you never seen that, or if someone's been doing that application for you your whole life, so And then exactly, when they look back, I'm pretty sure that things are part of the application. I don't know, things to better have but at the same time.
All right, everybody, I'm sorry, I know I gave you a difficult question, and I'm stopping you before the 5-minute mark again, probably, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna bring us back in. And I saw, so I actually got a great comment in the chat, so I wanted to make sure that get read. That gets read, geez, anyway, so from Miss Lisa in the chat, we have, relatively speaking, I'd say the impact has been status quo. In that diversity is at most C+. Universities do not represent the demographics of society. And that, okay, maybe just one or a few mentalities still permeates most campuses. So that's a good one. And then I see that Miss Gloria is also in here, so I want to make sure that I get that one too. So the era prior to 2023 reinforced the right of universities to consider race as a factor in their admissions. In that respect, they acknowledge the benefits of diversity. But the 2023 decision of the overwhelmingly conservative Supreme Court broke years of precedent. And ain't that the truth? So, 2 excellent comments. Thank you very much. Everybody in the chat, I really appreciate you guys participating virtually. It's fabulous. So everybody who's in the room, how are we feeling? What did this question bring out for you at your tables?
I'm gonna answer the first part.
Go ahead.
So the question was, does conscious, what is it, conscious,
Race conscious admission. Yeah.
I think definitely, positive.
Okay.
But I had to look at the question the second way. So the goal is to diversify the applicants, the full applicant.
Mhm.
And that's the target, that's the goal, and it was met.
Yep.
It was met. That image that you showed before, the 75% and 25%. So if you look into the 25%, we just had a whole conversation.
Yeah.
All right, long story, very, very short. So when you're submitting the application has to be complete, has to be organized, has to be easy to understand.
Yep.
And I was saying, a lot of people, if they're first generation college students,
Mhm.
that's their first time looking at a college application.
Sure.
So chances are, there are going to be many errors.
Mm.
So with that being said, I think that 25% is very useful for people who have never been introduced to any type of layout in that format.
Sure.
So I think in going with that process, it helps a lot of people who've never been given a chance. To work their lives. And it's also informing them of, you're entering this stage of academia, so this is how other forms will look like. So it's getting them to notice, this is the type of structure that you'll be entering to. So it gets them to see the future. So I think it was good.
Excellent. That's a very good point. So when we're talking about 75% getting on merit, and then you've only got 25 who are getting in on other factors, right? And you've only got 25% of those applications, it can be really hard for your students of color, for your first generation kids going to college. Like it can be a really difficult process, and having a process where you have that 25% set aside and you're looking at all of these factors to make sure that these disadvantaged communities or these disadvantaged students are getting the best shot. That's really good, right? It's a positive thing. And I mean, if you didn't make the 75%, you didn't make the 75%. What are we supposed to tell you here? Anybody else have any big feels about this question?
One thing that stood out to me just now was, it was Lisa's comment about women's housing. I think, you could be racially diverse, but you're also gonna feel like you're diverse as well. And looking at what you think is someone's perspective perspectives, the different experiences. I mean, when we're seeing all of that. And so you want to with different ways, different cultures. So
Right.
At the same time, the race conscious era wasn't just started.
Mhm. Excellent. And I love that you brought in that we've got to be looking at race as a mental thing, right? There's some basics that we have to function with here. And I'm gonna let you guys know right now that I very vehemently disagree with a lot of what the Supreme Court has to say about this. But my personal feelings is that just by virtue of growing up in America, you will be oh God, what's the word that I'm looking for? You will be exposed to white supremacy. And if you don't do anything about it, you will end up with some white supremacist views that are problematic, even if you're not white. If you're a Black person growing up in America, you could grow up with some white supremacist views. You could grow up hating yourself in this country if you do absolutely no work to the contrary. And when you have a country where you as a student could grow up in a white school and then go to a different white school and then go to a different white university, what are the chances that that student has no white supremacist views that are problematic? Really slim. So I feel there's a huge value to diversity on campuses, not just in giving diverse viewpoints, but in just learning how to be a functional human being who respects other human beings. And I feel that there's value to that. That don't look like you. And I think that value does not just exist for white students, although it's really big for them in America, considering that we've got this very white supremacist culture that we're growing up on. I think it's important for students of color to be able to meet other students of color and be able to understand how that works and be able to respect those boundaries and to respect those cultures. I think it's really great for you to meet kids of other religions and to expose yourself to others of those to make sure that you can be respectful there. If you are going to be a functioning, respectful member of society who doesn't promote racism, who is trying to have an equitable future, if that's what we're going for, and considering that we've got a 14th Amendment that says we're supposed to be moving towards an equitable future, or we're supposed to be an equitable country, I would think that that's a goal that we're trying to meet. If we are trying to meet that goal, you have to have diverse campuses. You have to have somewhere in your life where you meet somebody who doesn't look like you, just so you can figure out what that's like.
But that's our advantage.
It is an advantage for us, certainly.
You're challenging every time you step in those classes. Since I've been in the fourth grade, I've always been the one to speak up. It's always been put on me. And at times I was ridiculed by my own people.
Sure.
Okay, but it didn't matter because at some point it just made me stronger. But going back to your point, if you're not raised in a home where the parents set your being able to be strengthening and who you are as a person, then yes, you can go to those environments and feel totally intimidated.
Yeah.
Because on those campuses, the students are still separate.
Yes, they are.
That's student unions.
Yep.
But I feel, yes, it was an advantage for me to be in these settings where on many occasions I was the only one.
Sure.
And because I have a hearing disability, my father used to tell me, not because of the disability, so when you go to school, you gotta make sure you sit up on the car. Okay, so that, without even knowing that was beneficial to me.
For you. Right.
I would sit right up in the car.
Trying to get as much out of your education as humanly possible.
And stare around and wait for any word that would come out. But that shouldn't have been my perspective all the time. But yeah, I think it changes their perspective of when you base certain points in these classes. They're like, oh, never looked at it that way.
Right.
But you afford them that opportunity And I think many of them learn from that,
Right.
but some of them look, we're in our children. The whole country knows what well, I can't say no, but they're familiar with the enslavement process. and so forth. Not having a total, understanding of it. But they're so ready to turn out back.
Yep. And I think you're making an important point there, where we watched during the Trump era of our presidency, we watched the other members of our society do stuff that we were like, oh, wow, I thought we were done with that,
Exactly.
right? I thought we'd moved past that. And I think that that's an important thing to look at, right? How have we not moved past that? And part of the thing is the exposure in schools. How many Black people do you think Trump hung out with as a kid? I'm willing to bet it wasn't a bunch. Maybe the nanny, yeah, maybe the nanny, maybe. Maybe not. Maybe he didn't have a Black nanny. Point is though, right, but that's an excellent point, right? When you have these people with these attitudes, you can see who doesn't get exposed to other people's views. If you get to live in your own little bubble, entrenched in your racism and never get out of it, you can be a Trump president. And it's not a problem for you. It's doable in this country. If all you have to do is avoid diversity. And all of a sudden, you don't have this problem.
You still want to be the. So that's the issue that.
Sure, there's absolutely some cognitive dissonance where you want to believe the white supremacy. So you don't find any information to the contrary.
Insurrection, you wasn't rushing for.
Mm-hmm.
You stop there and look at that, you want to be, but you can see that, and throw something else.
Right. But
And
So-
what about
you'll definitely have some of those people, but I think that the way to avoid having too many of those people is to get your passive people, your people who don't really want to be racist, but they're not looking for diversity either. Give them some diversity. When they run off to college, they'll meet 3 Black people and a Jewish person and 1 Latino student and a couple of Asian students. They'll be like, oh, opinions outside of my own. Maybe my parents were wrong. Who knows, right? You want to see if you can get them. Listen, you got to see if you can get them that information. Yes.
One, niece that said, and she said it repeatedly, that in their family,
Mm-hmm.
some family racism was right. That
Yeah.
they-
That sounds right to me.
A lot of conversation around the dinner table about how bad those people are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that I want to say. The other thing that, with affirmative, with the history of affirmative action, so over, I guess, like 60 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
of affirmative action, one of the, positives is now you have a lot more Black than other places.
Sure.
So that on college campuses, it's not just that you see a Black kid in the classroom,
Mhm.
but you like have a Black professor.
Imagine a Black professor.
And so that diversity among faculty
Mhm.
has also had a very positive impact. And for some kids, you know, you might be the first Black professor
That could ever have.
but it tells them that at least that person, somebody Black, somebody that doesn't look like you could be a professor.
Absolutely.
So I think that, you know, there has been some real positives.
100%. And that's the point that I'm making. I really feel that diversity on campuses is a positive thing. It's a positive thing that we should be trying to promote as a society who's hopefully trying to move towards equality. It only makes sense in my brain. So I just wanted to make sure that we highlighted that. And I have a comment from Ms. Lisa that I really wanted to read. So the white patriarchal society we live in, the white patriarchal society we live in is the air we breathe. No one is exempt from it. So yes, we need to know what it is, what it does, and how it works. It's imperative. And she's right. It is important. It's super important. You have to unlearn a lot of things in America. I was 26 when I figured out that Tulsa, Oklahoma was real and got bombed by white people. I should not have been 27 when I heard that information for the first time. We live in a society where I didn't see a Black doll till I was 10. Doll time was over. Like This is just regular stuff that happens, and you don't even really think about it as a problematic thing, but these are burdens that your white counterparts do not have. So making sure that we got this stuff in and we are talking about it, so. Yeah, which is unacceptable. Yeah. It's really funny. You said drown towns. I live near one in upstate New York. Yeah, there will be a black town and they'll drown them,
Yes, black communities that were
wiped out.
white state.
Yes.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
What they did is that they replaced them with artificial.
Mhm.
No, just this week I learned from Brown.
It's real. So again, I just want to make sure that we are all working from this foundation because we are about to move forward into talking about the Supreme Court case. And I just want to ground us in this reality before we go to the circus that is this case. I apologize in advance. This is going to be the part of the presentation that gets super technical. Please feel free to stop me at any time and ask questions if there's something that you don't understand or that doesn't make sense. But I'm going to try to get us through this as best I possibly can. So let's talk about Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College. This is the 2023 Supreme Court case that was very recently decided that basically says race-conscious admissions is no longer acceptable. So let's get into it. So basically, I want to make sure that we have this background. This is what the admissions process for Harvard looks like. So the two schools that are being sued in this particular case is Harvard and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. UNC and Harvard have very similar, admissions processes. And also Harvard is the named school in the title. So I'm going to focus more on Harvard, but please understand that this applies to both Harvard and UNC. At Harvard, basically what happens is there's 3 stages for admissions. We go through a first reader who assigns a numerical score based on 6 categories. Academics, extracurriculars, athletics, school support, personal, and then an overall category. And then you give all of these as a composite sort of rating. The only category where the reader is allowed to look at someone's race is the overall category. Everything else, no. And then, by the way, each of these stages, everyone goes in blind. So race is not considered until after decisions are made. Race is considered in each of these steps, but not until after you've figured out all of the stuff. So your second phase is the subcommittee. There is a regional subcommittee that then goes through applications. And they also look at the criteria of each of these students. They start to make larger decisions based on what they think a good class would look like. They start picking students based on the number of students that they hope to have in their incoming student class body. And then again, they also are able to look at an applicant's race, but at the very end of the process. Then at the very end stage, we have what's called the lock phase. Now, the lock phase is where you create a lock list. It's all of the students who get discarded from the final pile of applicants who end up getting accepted. And there are 4 pieces of information that you are allowed to consider during this process. That's legacy status. So whether or not the student has a parent or family member who went to the school. You are allowed to look at athletic status, whether or not the student is a recruited athlete for the school. Financial aid eligibility. So whether the student gets financial aid. This is basically looking at class related stuff and socioeconomic status for your student. And then lastly, you can also look at a student's race. And each of these is listed as a positive. So you can look at any of these 4 things during the lock stage. If these students have it, it counts as a positive towards their application, and then they don't get locked. So that's pretty much it. The only other important thing to add here is that Harvard has said that during their admission process, that race is a determinative tipping point for lots of students who are admitted that are African American and Hispanic. So their race is the extra point that tips them over and makes them part of the pile as opposed to not part of the pile. So that's pretty much how the process goes. And it's fairly similar for UNC. So again, race conscious, we are considering race, but certainly there's no quota. They're not looking for any particular type of student. And at the end stage, they're really only looking at race to make sure that they have the same or close numbers to the racial makeup of the previous year. That's how Harvard generally does their thing. So they're trying to make sure that they don't have fewer Black students than they did the year before by any wide margin or anything like that. So that's pretty much what we're looking for here. Yeah, that's pretty much the process. Yes, Miss Lisa, Harvard is private and UNC is a public school. You are absolutely correct. So, facts of the case. So the person who is suing, the petitioner in this case, is Students for Fair Admissions. I actually should move this so you guys can see the one Asian student there. That is the student who sued. So in November of 2014, they filed suit against Harvard and UNC, arguing that their race-based admission programs violate Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Basically, they're calling it a racism. So the trial court concluded that, the student in question applied for Harvard and UNC. I believe they didn't get into UNC, but were waitlisted for Harvard, and then sued because they expected an acceptance letter, not a waitlist letter. So the trial court concluded that Harvard's admissions program was fine, complies with constitutional decisions previously. So yeah, not a big deal, totally fine. The circuit court, which is the next level up, also saw the case after it was appealed, and they had the same decision that it was totally fine. And Harvard and UNC's admissions process is fine. The Supreme Court takes certiorari, they agree to the petition and they look at the case, and they have decided that Harvard and UNC's admissions program policies violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They do not specifically talk about whether or not it violates Title VII, but they very specifically looked at whether or not this goes against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So let's talk about what that means. So the 14th Amendment is our equal protection clause. It says that everyone is entitled to equal protection under the law. This very specifically relates to government things. The reason why this applies to colleges and universities is because students receive financial aid, which is a government program. So anything where you're receiving any sort of government finances puts you under government scrutiny and makes you applicable to stuff like equal protection. So schools are held to abide by equal protection. They're supposed to create equal protection for their students. So what they asserted in this particular case is that, first of all, eliminating discrimination means eliminating all of it. So basically, you can't have discrimination against Black people. You certainly can't have discrimination against white people or Asian people. It has to be equal protection for everyone. So basically, race-conscious admissions is generally against the 14th Amendment. So we have old cases that have basically said, if you're using race-conscious admissions in general, that's bad. The reason why we allow it is because it's narrowly tailored. So in order for you to be allowed to, this is like an exception to the 14th Amendment, right? So generally shouldn't be allowed to do race-conscious admissions, but we're allowing it if it meets strict scrutiny, which has a two-part test. So under the two-part test, it has to, one, further a compelling government interest, and two, has to be narrowly tailored, which means it's necessary to achieve the goal that it's trying to achieve. We got this so far? All right. So the strict scrutiny test that we have for schools specifically was created in the Bakke case by Justice Powell. So there are two compelling interests that are kind of accepted or were accepted by the Supreme Court. One was remediating specific past discriminations that violated the Constitution. So that, and then two, avoiding imminent and serious risk to human safety. So you are allowed, those are two compelling interests that are fine to use if you are circumventing the 14th Amendment and using race-conscious admissions. So Justice Powell did say that remedying the effects of societal discrimination is insufficient because it's an amorphous concept of injury that may be ageless as it reaches into the past. So basically, he's saying that if you're trying to admit students because the school used to be racist, that's not okay with him, because then you'd have to go so far back into the past and look at the histories of these schools to really figure out if they were racist. And he thinks that's a bad claim. So we're not allowed to use that anymore. The one thing that you are allowed to use as a compelling interest is obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a racially diverse student body. So if that's the compelling interest that you're trying to meet as a school, that's fine under the strict scrutiny test that we're looking at. That's pretty much it for this. Yeah. Just a slight caveat in that you're only allowed to use race as a plus on a student's application. You're not allowed to use it as a negative. So you can look at a Black or brown student's application and give them an extra plus for being a student of color. You cannot look at a white student's application and give them a ding for being white. That makes sense? Okay, so that's where we are on the rules for this so far. So the Supreme Court in this case said that Harvard and by extension UNC failed strict scrutiny. So they failed that two-part test. One of the reasons why they have such strict rules for this two-part test is that they're trying to avoid the risk of illegitimate stereotyping or viewing race as a negative. So basically what I just said, where you give somebody a ding for being of a certain race because they're not a student of color. So they're trying to avoid that problem. And they are basically saying that Harvard is doing it by giving, by using the process that they use and looking at the race of those students so closely in all three parts of their process. They are essentially giving a ding to students of color and giving a negative to other students. Very specifically in this, they are talking about Asian students of color who, according to the First Circuit, there we go. Sorry, I must have missed it. Anyway, so in the First Circuit, it did come out that there are fewer Asian students in Harvard's pool this year than there was last year. So Harvard is getting fewer and fewer Asian students, as opposed to other races of students. So based on that information, they're basically saying that Harvard is discriminating against Asian students. And that their scrutiny process or their process of screening students basically requires stereotyping. So that's pretty much where we are with that part. They've also said that Harvard does not have a compelling interest. So again, he said that the one compelling interest that the Supreme Court will accept is that you're looking to benefit from a more diverse student body. The compelling interest that Harvard gave was training future leaders in public and private sectors, preparing graduate students to adapt to an increasingly pluralistic society, better educating its students through diversity, and producing new knowledge stemming from diverse outlooks. Basically what happened here is they used the wrong term. This is very technical here. So Harvard doesn't specifically say that they want their students to benefit from a more diverse student body, with the exception of their third thing, which is better educating its students through diversity. But there's some caveats there that basically the Supreme Court said means that these goals are unmeasurable. So the court has no idea how to decide when Harvard has reached those goals. So because the Supreme Court feels that you can't measure whether or not you've prepared a student to adapt to a more diverse environment or a more diverse society, that's not a compelling interest. So if the Supreme Court can't measure it, doesn't count as a compelling interest, you can't use that. So Harvard has, in this case, no compelling interest to have a diverse interest. They also believe that it's not narrowly tailored. So they don't believe that they're looking at the student's case-by-case basis and making as informed a decision as they could. Very specifically, they point out that when Harvard makes their decisions based on race, Sorry, I'm just gonna read it out because it's to achieve the educational benefit of diversity, Harvard measures the racial composition of their classes using racial categories that are plainly overbroad. For example, they just use the term Asian as opposed to South Asian or East Asian in order to adequately decide how many Asian students they should have in their class. Or they arbitrarily use the term Hispanic without determining which Latino students specifically you're talking about. And there is no category at all for Middle Eastern students. So they believe that Harvard's process is not specific enough to promote the goal of diversity that they are saying they're trying to reach. So the unclear connection between
Mariana.
the goal of Harvard that Harvard seeks and the means they employed precludes the court from meaningfully scrutinizing respondents' admissions program. So basically, they don't like Harvard's process, is where we're going here. So if the Supreme Court says that your process is not clear enough, then you are failing to be narrowly tailored. What else? Harvard has failed to present an exceedingly persuasive justification for separating students on the basis of race that is measurable and concrete enough to permit judicial review. So they are separating students based on race, and they're saying that this diversity will be helpful for their students, but they don't really have any data to back up whether or not it's actually been beneficial. So the Supreme Court says if there's no data that proves that having a diverse campus is helpful, then we're going to pretend that having a diverse campus is unhelpful, and there's really no point for you to have this goal. So that's out.
Question.
Yes.
They talk about the not looking at a diverse Asian population or diverse Latino population.
Mhm.
Do they comment at all about not, and I don't know what you call it, looks at a diverse Black population because it's not just one Black population.
Yep.
Monolithic,
It's not, but would you be surprised? No, that was not brought up in the Supreme Court decision that there is no, I don't believe Harvard has a division between their Black students. I'm pretty sure they also have a category that's just Black students. And I assume that the students self-identify for these categories as well. So there's that. But yeah, so no, they did not bring up that at all, mostly probably because they don't care and it's not relevant to this particular case. Marianne. That's a great question. I assume the reason you have these categories is because these are the categories that exist when people fill out the application. So I don't think that Harvard is coming up with these categories on their own, but like when you fill out your college application on whatever, they usually ask you to check off what race do you think that you apply to, and it's generally these particular boxes. There usually isn't a box that says, are you East Asian or Southeast Asian? Or are you Native American? What kind of Native American? Like there usually isn't that sort of division. So that, yes.
For Harvard, this is probably a tough question, but
Nope, no dumb questions, please.
presidents graduating from the school, a lot of.
Yep.
That's what happens to graduating from the school.
Mhm.
That's the popular, that's the reason why, because
Why they're going for Harvard?
why a lot of people gain access to that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, there's a regular trail of time for years,
Mhm.
and this fraternity, and it's a bit more like you take oaths, like they have to accept you, and then people that haven't accepted, but
Yeah, Harvard is one of those schools where so many people apply and a fraction of those students get admitted to the school. And we're going to talk about this a little bit further down the line, but legacy was one of those 4 things that I mentioned. Hang on, let's go back real quick. It should be not here, not here, here. All right, so we have Harvard's admissions process. We're in the lot phase. There we go. So lot phase allows you to look at legacy, athletic status, financial aid, and race. Notice race is the only one being challenged here. No one is challenging legacy status. No one is challenging your athletic status. No one is challenging your financial aid status. And none of these are merit-based options. All of these are coincidental. Well, minus the legacy stuff, that's got a history of racism attached to it. So there's that. Looks like we have a question from the chat, so give me just a second. Yeah, it is interesting that the government is not required to do those categories themselves. The Supreme Court is being harder on Harvard than they are on government organizations who have similar categories where they separate kids based on race. So hang on, where was I? All right. Oh, the end plan. So as I brought up in one of the other cases, there was Supreme Court Justice O'Connor who said, I believe in the Grutter case. I'm messing up that name, Grutter, I don't know. But they said in that 2003 case that they expected affirmative action to exist for another 25 years and then we wouldn't need it anymore. This Supreme Court has decided that that's close to actual truth. Where they were like, yeah, 25 years seems like more than enough years. If you're doing the math, 25 years from 2003 is 2028. So that would give us 5 more years of affirmative action before it's over. So one of the things that they talked about in the Supreme Court case was that Harvard has this race conscious admissions, but without an end goal when it comes to diversity. So Harvard has zero plan for when they're going to stop doing this. And they don't like that. So Harvard suggests that the end of race-based admissions program will occur once meaningful representation and diversity is achieved on their campuses. The problem is that outright balancing is patently unconstitutional. So yeah, that's a thing. In the Fisher case, one of the Supreme Court justices who wrote the opinion held that outright racial balancing is actually unconstitutional. So you can't have a racially balanced campus, actually. So that's not the goal that we should be moving towards, apparently. And if you say it, it's bad. Respondent's other point. So Harvard also says that when students receive an education, students receive an educational benefit from diversity. However, the Supreme Court here holds that it's unclear how a court is supposed to determine how a student benefits from a diverse campus. And since they can't quantify how you diversify a campus and that benefits your students, it should not be something that the respondent should be able to use as an argument. So Harvard's argument that having a diverse campus is good for their student means nothing. Okay, yeah. So because Harvard's admission program lacks sufficient focus and measurable objectives for the use of race, unavoidably the use of race in a negative manner involving racial stereotyping and lack of meaningful ends, those admissions programs cannot be reconciled with guarantees of equal protection under the law. So because Harvard's focus is not narrow enough, because they have no end goal in sight, and because they view race in some cases as a negative, it does not fit under equal protection or under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So at the same time, at the very end of the opinion, they put this in, at the same time, nothing prohibits universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected the applicant's life, so long as the discussion is concretely tied to the quality of character or unique ability of the particular applicant to contribute to the university. So you can still write about race in your essay. The school just can't look at it as one of the factors for deciding whether or not you get to go to their school. So again, time for affirmative action is over. So again, we go back to the Grutter case where we said 20 years, 25 years from then, we should be done. Harvard did try to make the argument that they have 5 more years left if that's the goal of the court. And the court again mentions that Harvard has no particular end date in sight. So moot argument for them, or at least they're not considering it. What else? Nope. Nothing else? I think that's it. Yep. Yep.
Refer back to the agency.
Not really. He too.
He sued, but he was suing because I feel like he was saying that they gave preference to a black over him.
Yes.
So did the case point back to that?
Nope. Case barely talks about that kid. I promise you, he is not mentioned. So the conclusion of this case is that both programs, being Harvard and UNC, lack sufficient focus and measurable objectives warranting the use of race as a thing. They employ race in a negative manner, they involve racial stereotyping, and they have no meaningful endpoint. We have never permitted admissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. Nothing in this opinion can be constructed as prohibiting universities from considering an application's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. And that is the conclusion of the majority of the court. There is blessedly a dissenting opinion from our new Black female Supreme Court justice, where she attempts to tear the majority a new one. It doesn't really do anything, but at least that dissenting opinion exists. So that's pretty much where we are with this case. I tried to get through everything, but if does anybody have any questions, is there anything that you wanted to know a little bit more about that I didn't cover?
No, but I would say it's almost clear that they just use that case to get rid of the affirmative action. Because if they didn't conclude that therefore Susan blah blah is discriminated against, it should have been admitted, then it's almost like that the case wasn't about him.
It wasn't. That's very good. Yes, that's a very good conclusion to draw. This case really wasn't about the kid who brought the case. It was an opportunity for a conservative Supreme Court to get rid of affirmative action, and they took it.
So right now they're still deciding on they can visit it or.
No, it's gone. This case is out. It's published. Officially, the Supreme Court has said you are no longer allowed to use race-conscious admission strategies. And again, and so Harvard's admissions process that we went over is very similar to the majority that you will see in most college campuses. Maybe not as extensive because Harvard's such a big school, but generally speaking, they all work fairly the same. Post the Grutter case in 2003, almost all schools moved their admissions process towards being something like that. So every school who works that way is going to have to change.
Do we know if the kid is in college anywhere?
I actually don't know yet. I bet he is though. If he got into Harvard, he got in somewhere else.
Alright.
He'll be fine.
So basically, from what I'm hearing, he's sued because he didn't get into Harvard.
He sued because he got
Okay, right?
he sued because he got waitlisted for Harvard, which means he technically got in. If somebody decided they weren't going, he was on the list. He would have been in.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're considered racist to get it in.
Right. That's it. That's it. You're technically, they're like, hey, congratulations, you're good enough to be in the school. If somebody from our main list decides that they don't want to come, you're in.
Right.
Did you have a?
But when is that? The year of that?
Oh, this is 2013, 2013. This is 2023. This just happened.
Yeah, but it's by application.
Oh, in November of 2014, I think. Wait, hang on. Let's go back. It's in there. It's in there. Yeah, November of 2014.
Okay, so that's it. Case.
Oh, it's way past that. He's finished. Oh, yeah, and then I threw this graphic in there because I have, yeah, I'm mean about it. Petty. All right, so, oh, yes, and I wanted to leave you guys with something. Hang on, we're gonna avoid that question real quick while we go through this. What can schools do to still promote diversity? Because I don't want to leave you on, yeah, and the Supreme Court is terrible. So there are a couple of things that schools can do and schools are doing. Oh, yep, that sounds good. So here are some things that we got going on that are possibilities that aren't necessarily the same thing as race conscious admissions. So there's a lot of reliance on standardized testing that is disadvantaging people of color. You can get rid of those tests. You don't need them. So things like the SAT, scrap them. That would help promote diversity on campus. Expanding outreach and recruitment pathways from middle school and high school. So colleges have the resources to be able to go to people's middle schools and high schools and try to recruit students as early as they'd like. So if they want more diverse students, they can absolutely do better and more recruiting. You can actually, no, we're gonna skip that one. Engage in holistic admissions where you evaluate an applicant's demonstrated capacity and strengths in light of resources and opportunities. So that is something that the Supreme Court brought up, where they said that this case doesn't preclude anyone from looking at a student's race as it pertains to their essay on whether or not it's, affected their life or how it shaped their characteristics. So you can do that. You can reform your secondary admissions process to create unfair and unnecessary barriers to major education. So that's always good. Whatchamacallit? You can consider an individual's cultural or political background as opposed to the student's race. You can eliminate legacy preferences. That's the one that I promote the most. You can remove barriers for justice impacted students. You can remove financial barriers to enrollment. So there's a lot of schools that have financial barriers, just like in the application process itself, like the application itself is expensive. So, make it free. Get yourself some more diverse student bodies. And you can adopt guaranteed admissions where the top 10% kids from whatever school get automatic admission into your school if they apply. So that's in there.
The remark about the SAT, that's the next step.
Yes, SATs is the first. So eliminate reliance on standardized testing. So SAT would be part of your standardized testing thing. Get rid of it and you'll be fine. And one more thing, I just want to, yes. All right. So what is already being done? So there is stuff that's already happening. Very specifically, if you look at California had a whole thing where they have a law in California against affirmative action. So they actually could have race conscious admissions processes because the state had outlawed affirmative action effectively. So they had to go through an entirely different process. And it's important to note, though, that when they got rid of affirmative action in University of California, Berkeley, and UCLA, the number of Black and Latino student freshmen fell by 50% the year after you passed that. So it's clear that affirmative action gets students of color into schools. So just pointing out that that's important. But schools in California did more aggressive recruitment. They tried to get more students of color into their student body, and they have been doing better, although notably UCLA never got back to the stats that they had before you got rid of affirmative action as a law. So that, but also in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling that just happened, a couple of universities, Wesleyan included, have decided to get rid of their legacy student policies. So that is also what they're doing. Yep. And that's pretty much it. And the question that I'll leave you with, you can answer it now or on your own, however you're feeling, but do you agree or disagree with this Supreme Court decision and its reasoning? I'm sure you can tell where I fall on this spectrum, but I leave the question to you guys. And if you have any final questions for me, please feel free to ask, but otherwise, that is the end of this community cafe and this presentation. And I really appreciate all you guys for being here.
And it is on YouTube.
It's gonna be long.
Well, it's gonna be long, but also the period beginning to have nothing on it. I'll have to bring it up, but it will be on YouTube. So, but thank you, Mariana, for a great, very thorough.
I tried. Thanks for sitting with me through all of this. I know it was a lot.
Thank you. And thank you to the people who are.
Yes, thank you, everybody on Zoom. Miss Lisa, thank you so much. I love your comments. Yeah, this is amazing. I really appreciate this. Oh yeah, still pizza, everybody. Oh, hang on. Sorry, Miss Lisa asked me to read her comment out loud, so I'm going to do it. I have thoroughly enjoyed this cafe. Honestly, I thought the agenda overpromised, but quite frankly, you over-delivered. Thank you, Mariama. Oh, thank you, and attendees. This was so much soul food for thought, like a good community familial meal where I ate too much. I gotta go take a nap. Let's settle this down. When I wake up and face the circus, I shall be equipped with knowledge, and that is power. Let us fight on. The struggle continues. So there we are. But thank you so much, Miss Lisa, and thank you so much, everybody else. I'm gonna end the Zoom now, but I really appreciate all you guys for being here. Have a beautiful rest of your day.